It's time now for World Watchers International with Mae Brussell, who for over 17 years has investigated and exposed political conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's broadcast number 505, and it's August the 9th, 1981. I think it is. The time goes so quickly I can't keep track sometimes. I did make one error last week. I think this is beginning my 11th year on the air, and I can't remember a time where I have done this, or else people haven't called attention to it, and nobody caught it yet. But I realized as soon as I was home and the program was over that I had confused two names of information about a particular party, the behavior of Ed Butler, working for the Young Americans for Freedom as an agent provocateur. He worked for Patrick Frawley, not Ed Pauley. Ed Pauley, who died recently, who was a very wealthy oil man in California, was the man who prepared Lyndon Johnson for the 1960 conventions and convinced him to run against John Kennedy at that time. He was active in the party. He originated from Indianapolis and moved to California, and he coordinated Lend-Lease supplies in Great Britain with the Soviet Union. And this man was very active, working parallel and along with Patrick Frawley, Ed Pauley. The name I got wrong. It was Ed Pauley, who passed away last week, but Ed Butler, the man that I mentioned, worked for Patrick Frawley in California. He worked for Frawley and formed the original Libertarian Party there. He had an organization that the CIA had set up. They called themselves the Libertarian, and Ed Butler had worked for Patrick Frawley and Charles Colson at the Hard Hat demonstrations for the Information Council of the Americas to have demonstrations, and he worked with Lee Harvey Oswald to set up a cover that he was an agent of Fidel Castro or sympathetic to Castro, where he actually worked for the CIA. Ed Butler also, as I said before, had spread a cover story, the first published article that the blacks had killed Sharon Tate and her family and her friends, her baby and her friends, her unborn child, and the LaBiancas. It was Ed Butler who was doing all this mischief, but he worked for Patrick Frawley and not Ed Pauley. And as soon as I got home, I should have looked that up on my files when Ed Pauley passed away. But they had worked so closely together in Los Angeles area, in the clandestine operations and in the political parties that put Lyndon Johnson into power. The excuse is not good enough. I shouldn't make that kind of a mistake, and I don't remember if I've done it before, but I apologize. They're both passed away, but that's not the point. This evening, Ronald Reagan pulled the strategy that was described in the New York Times as Reagan's good news strategy. He comes out on the screen and tells you, or in the Rose Garden, what's good news, and then when there's bad news, an article in the Times described how he disappears then and leaves the press to answer any questions. He disappeared with the air controllers strike, and he no sooner got out to California to Santa Barbara Ranch, and he let go of the decision of the neutron bombs. He doesn't have to see people, and he's far away from the action. And he says the opinion of the Allies, he sent a message, has nothing to do with Americans want to do to defend themselves. He also limited questions of his aides this week. He's the first president of the United States. It's unprecedented, according to Associated Press story, the unprecedented gag rule on reporters in the Oval Office and picture-taking sessions and so forth, that if they ask questions of him, they will be fired. And he left angrily and will not answer the questions, and has demanded that the press corps, members of the press who cannot observe the request, are asked to excuse themselves from any photo sessions. As I say, this is described as unprecedented of any president, but he is unprecedented, so it's par for the course for Ronald Reagan. There are a bundle of news stories I want to cover. I'm just, again, going to list the date and the titles for you people who tape the shows and look up the articles, because hopefully I'll get back to them. I know I will, but I want to run them down now while they're easy for you to get. I don't have the page numbers of the newspapers, and I promised a listener from now on I'd put that on the printed sheets for you. If you want the bibliographies of the program, you can write to me, send a self-addressed stamped envelope with 25 cents enclosed for the printing. And I'll send you sheets from any program or series that you want with the information that we have on the air. One story that I briefly I think mentioned for a second last week that I still want to get back to is July 29th, 1981, a New York Times story, secret group linked to the killing of French detective. That's Dr. Jacques Massie, M-A-S-S-I-E, his wife, his in-laws, his 8-year-old son, and a friend. The important thing is that he was murdered in Marseille. He was part of the French internal security system, the secret army organization. He had to work with Licio Gelli, the Italian Masonic leader of the Italian Masonic scandal that has fled down to Argentina. And the New York Times quoted one person of saying he had to be shot. He knew too much. This is a man that could link to the Marseille, Turkey narcotic connections that I talked about earlier, the motive for shooting John Paul II and for shooting Ronald Reagan at this time. There's an interconnecting link, a lot of links I want to get into, but in the meantime, get that story. Another story, July 26, 1981, fugitive ex-agent offers deal. CIA Edwin Wilson meets U.S. officials in Rome, Italy, also in Rome. I've done many, many weeks on Edwin Wilson, the agent who hires assassination teams, who deals in assassination weapons, narcotics traffic, and death, deals in those. That's the way he makes his living, selling not only Gaddafi, but Idi Amin in many, many countries and organizations around the world. Now, Wilson's been charged with a murder charge and for weapons selling, dealing in the United States, and he is in Rome. Interpol let him in. They are meeting with agents to make a deal that Wilson would come home and not have the murder charges because he has that $3 million farm next to Senator John Warner in Virginia. His wife wants the property, and there's a divorce coming up there. He's left the country. He made a deal. It's in the Washington Post. If you will give me immunity for the murder charge, I'll kidnap and produce 2 agents that the CIA wants. Well, he's very generous. He was going to bring in 2 agents, some Cubans and Chilean nationals that are down in Chile that were involved in the Orlando Letelier and Sandra Moffat murder. So here's a guy who hires from the highest levels of the CIA these people, and he was linked to the detonation bombs that went off, did the murder on Embassy Row, and he says, I'll bring in 2 of my employees if you get me off. And I believe that that deal was made by July 26, 1981. Before this, they were trying to squeeze Mr. Casey out of the CIA with his links to Robert Vesco to get Mr. In from Navy intelligence. And Casey probably pulled a, no, you can't fire me or I'll pull the rug out from under you. They released Max Ugel, who was a deputy under Casey, sacrificial lamb in a ball of wax there. But that's why the talk of murdering Gaddafi that was in the Newsweek magazine and on the headlines just a week and a half ago came out. I'm sure that Edwin Wilson wouldn't bring home 2 Chileans from South America for his immunity, so he probably was going to go for the big boy, which would be Gaddafi, and that's why the plans to kill Gaddafi were spread around the world, and members of Congress had stopped at that, and then they switched and said, no, we were going to have a coup in Mauritania. The transaction of switching from Gaddafi to Mauritania to Chileans to bring them home makes sense when one of the biggest officials since the Watergate is bargaining to come back to the United States. This is an important story. He's making deals now to wipe out some of his agents. Now, one of his agents is Abu Daoud, D-A-O-U-D, who was shot 6 times in Warsaw just this week. He isn't dead yet, and the headlines have been saying a man blamed for the Munich massacre, the Olympic Games, the Israeli athletes, was shot in Poland. This was August the 6th, 1981, the London Daily Telegraph and the San Jose Mercury. Terrorists blamed for Munich massacre shot in Warsaw. But in January 23rd, 1978, the Associated Press had PLO's Olympic massacre boss and 7 others slain, Ali Salameh in Beirut. Now, we've read that Carlos the Jackal was involved with the Munich killings. Terpil and Corcola and Wilson were involved. And we have a man in 1978 that was supposed to be murdered who was the boss. And just this week, another boss was shot. So the point is that in exchange for Wilson being allowed to come back to this country and start his own killing operations again, there's going to be a lot of deaths to prove that he's cleaning up the operations, and all of them are the people that he worked with and hired or had somebody hire for him. They're great heroes in this country, and if you're thinking of joining the CIA, you better think twice of what they do to you if they want to bargain for their own lives. August the 4th, 1981, another article, Unhappy Millionaire Carlos Marcello, the mob boss from New Orleans, has been convicted on one charge of conspiracy. 11 charges were dropped, but his co-worker, Irv Davidson, got off. He also had been indicted down in New Orleans. I did a broadcast, I don't remember how long ago, I'll have to look that up, on Irv Davidson. He is one of the highest officials of the United States government who goes all the way from the John Kennedy assassination up to the present era of conspiracies and espionage agency operations. Irv Davidson, no way could be indicted he was indicted, but convict him would be like getting Agnew, Nixon, and John Mitchell out of office. Those men went out, but they were heavily paid off, and are all ganging together now. But Irv Davidson simply knows too much, and he threatened to talk, as have others, so he got off his charges. And Marcello not only was convicted this week, but then he was indicted the same day in Los Angeles for bribing Judge Pragerson on another mob case. So maybe Marcello, the unhappy millionaire, is getting old, and maybe they'll sacrifice him too, so that the team stays in office. New West, August the 8th this week, has an article, Murder in Paradise. I talked a while back on that murder down in Santa Barbara of Giovanni Schoenman, he's an artist and sculptor, Kimberly Roberts, and Cornelius Mull. Get the article if you're interested in that subject. It hits bases onto art galleries and drug dealing or diamond dealing, as whichever you want. It's in Lompoc and Santa Barbara, right next to the federal prison, and also he has a home right not too far from Ronald Reagan's ranch. It involves Iran and London and South Africa, a Seattle court reporter, South Korea, and another interlocking ball of wax. It's an interesting article. Get that if you can. New York Times, August the 14th, 1981. Worry over illegal arms exports grows among... No, July 14th, 1981. I'm going too fast for you, or for me. July 14th. It's a month ago already. Worry over illegal arms exports growing among the U.S. prosecutors. And it's got a picture of Edwin C. Wilson, the same man who is in Rome, Italy, meeting with the very person that was doing the stories on Mohammed Ajah and the shooting of the Pope. These are interlocked espionage operations, and Edwin Wilson is sitting in Rome with immunity at the present time. And this article is about weapons being taken out of China Lake, California, and stolen under the eyes or for the CIA. It has to do with various agents that went to Philadelphia and then were apprehended in California. And this also has this article, a lot to do with Frank Terpil's activities and Edwin Wilson. I'll get back to the article later, the interlocking links of the CIA to these people. And then that goes on down to Texas, to the shooting of Judge Wood, who was cracking down on narcotics traffic and on narcotic crimes. And then later, maybe a few months from now, if I have time, we'll go and make the connections of these people to the killing of particular witnesses in that jail in New Mexico where they were tortured and wiped out, witnesses to these very important events that were all wiped out that particular evening in a cruel manner. Another article in the New York Times, July 23rd, a week later. Inquiry in smuggling finds New York role in arms trafficking. And this has to do, again, with weapons being sent out of California and through New York of Terpil and George Corcola. This article then mentions George Corcola. Jack Anderson is writing about Edwin Wilson and Frank Terpil, and he leaves out Corcola. And I wonder why he leaves him out, because Corcola is the biggie of if there's four men, Theodore Shackley, Edwin Wilson, Frank Terpil, and George Corcola. Jack Anderson has a little allergy to that name, so write it down or circle it if you have the printed sheet. He had an article this week, August the 5th, Notorious Associate, and he tells about John Dutcher, D-U-T-C-H-E-R, who's a member of the notorious Terpil Wilson gang of international gun runners and cutthroats, and he felt that they were after his associate for the research they have done on Terpil and Wilson, and they felt that Dutcher had a hit list it does have a hit list that includes the name of his associate, Dale Van Atta, who's been investigating the Terpil-Wilson operation for almost a year now. He said the only time Dutcher's name surfaced was in New York Times, December 24th, 1979, where they described in the New York Times a third man who worked with a team of assassins and bragged that he was an international assassin and killed other people, and worked with Frank Terpil in England, where they owned a lodge, a hunter's lodge in Crewe, England. Now, Jack Anderson refers to the New York Times leaving out a third man's name, and he's writing about Dutcher and Wilson and Terpil. But Jack Anderson is leaving out George Corcola's name. And Jack Anderson has a very interesting background of tangled connections to the Korea Gate gang and to Madame Chenault and to the Mormon Mafia in Utah. And Jack Anderson is very selective. What he writes is good, but he keeps referring to a third man that Dutcher worked for, but he won't use the name George Corcola. It'd be interesting to find out why. Also, there was an article, Panamanians' Grief Over Torrijos is Hardly Visible. This is Los Angeles Times, August the 4th, 1981, and it tells how Barbara Bush, the wife of our vice president, was sent to the funeral of Torrijos. That's interesting because Anderson had an article also the end of July that Marcos is due for a fall. We sent Vice President Bush to the inauguration of Marcos, to that rigged election of that miserable fascist. And then we sent his wife, that poor woman, down to the funeral of this drug dealer, this Torrijos. We're sending them to the biggest narcotic traffic places in the world, but that's fitting for the vice president and the former director of the CIA, because that's what their game is narcotics traffic at the highest levels. So it's fitting that Mrs. Bush goes to Panama and he goes to the Philippines, I guess, to cover their bases. We also sent the Joint Chief of Staff down at the funeral. This was August 4th, 1981, of Torrijos, where he was described as such a fine, wonderful person. The Los Angeles Times said that for nearly 13 years there was repression, corruption, bad economics, and he couldn't get more than 10% of the vote, so he gave it to somebody else, and then he kept all the power. And Reagan at one time had called him a tin horn dictator, but now he was very important to American and narcotics traffic, and Mr. Bush was giving him a different kind of a message of deep sorrow, as was Jimmy Carter. They sent the Shah down there when he wasn't wanted here. Well, the funeral described in the Los Angeles Times, August the 4th, 1981, describes, as I say, as corrupt and repressive and so forth. But the next day, August the 5th, 1981, the New York Times has an article, FBI reveals a huge probe of drug cash. And this article goes into that Florida arrest of a multi-million-dollar narcotic trade that supplies $4 billion annual surplus. The Federal Reserve reports a $4 billion surplus, and the narcotics that goes through Miami is a $7 billion a year. Federal Reserve banks have currency shortages. The Federal Reserve Bank has been reporting a $4 billion annual surplus. The retail trade in illegal narcotics traffic in this area in Panama is $7 billion, so that's $3 billion more than the Federal Reserve had. And they made a investigation and used laundered money and pulled in 61 suspects. At the time, 28 were arrested in one place and seized one evening this last week. They had $4 million in cash. They had $2 million in a Panamanian bank account, $2 million in real estate, and the contents of 58 bank accounts in Florida. So Torrijos dies in a plane crash the week of August the 2nd in Panama, and he's strongly linked to narcotics traffic for years, ever since he's been in office, and escalating. And the same time that his plane blows up, the FBI have arrested these people with the Panamanian money, and I'm sure there was no connection between the necessity to blow up Torrijos and the money found from Panama in that drug arrest. Don't think that I would ever believe there is a connection any more than Jim Jones deposits in Panama banks, and all the drugs that they had, and gun running and medical experiments on people. I don't want you to think I'm jumping to conclusions, hardly. There's an article, San Francisco Chronicle, the Associated Press, CIA Jonestown link. They're going to try and defend Larry Layton in the charges of shooting a federal agent at the airport, and Chief of Mission Richard Dwyer, former U.S. Chief of Mission in Guyana, and also a Representative Leo Ryan. Layton has been charged with the shootings, and the defense team are going to use a CIA link. They're not going too well. I've worked or talked with the defense team, and the CIA is holding up all their papers. Most of the papers on Jonestown, it's completely bottled up, but that's the line that they're going to do, and the newspaper covered it that way. I mentioned last week the murder, the beating up and kidnapping of Max C. Ugel. He's the brother of a man who was working in the security system in Japan. His brother was in Japan for many years with the CIA, undercover agent with various agencies, and he was dropped out of the CIA as the deputy director of the operations, the secret clandestine operations, when the heat came on Casey for putting him there. But this Ugel, the chief of clandestine operations, was an important man in Japan. And just when this story broke about William Casey, and they're going to exhume Dennis McNeil, the brother of the two men that blew the whistle on Ugel. I talked last week about his being murdered, Dennis McNeil. But this Ugel was an important man in Japan, and he worked over there. And as the stories were breaking, I said on the air last week about the head of the Japanese mafia, the large head, being murdered last week, the vice president of Wells Fargo being stabbed to death, the links of the Wells Fargo missing millions of dollars to the Japanese mafia and intertangled espionage stories. Ugel worked in Japan, and so did William Colby as a lobbyist for Japanese operations that could be CIA fronts for all of Southeast Asia, and even were for the SLA when it formed in this country with Colston Westbrook. So the Ugel story is a big story because of his Japanese links. And just when all this can of worms was breaking, the brother of McNeil, the fellows that blew the case on Ugel, one of them was beaten up. He was kidnapped and beaten several times and had serious injuries, and he died June the 1st. Well, that was just recently when all of these stories, the tumult and the revelations of the Wells Fargo and the Nugan Hand Bank were breaking. This brother of the two fellows that worked with Ugel, he died a death that is questionable. So they are going to exhume him to find out what was on his body and determine the cause of his injuries, because he had injuries, and they put him to rest without, thank goodness they didn't cremate him, and goodness knows what they'll find. But now they're admitting that the death, June the 1st, was questionable. So that they're going to bring up Dennis McNeil. His brothers are still hiding. They claim they'll surface soon. They're still alive. And they blew the whistle on a very important man, Max Ugel, who worked mostly in Japan and was a close associate of William Casey, who is holding the line in the CIA, at least for the time being. Wall Street Journal had an article August the 4th, 1981. Casey flap laid by some to the old boys who want a career officer at the CIA helm. They want an admiral, they want a Navy intelligence man. With the airstrike, we're going to have the military at the airports. We'll have the Navy and the Army in the drug control operation, and they want a Navy person. We had one under Jimmy Carter as director of the CIA. Stanfield Turner was a graduate of Annapolis along with Jimmy Carter. And what they're really pushing for is a military man at all bases and cover this country pretty tight, getting rid of the civilian offices and putting in the military. I want to mention, now some of those stories I'm going to go back to at length later, and it took me a half hour to run down some of them, but they're very important articles, and you shouldn't miss them in the local papers, and it's easier to get them in the week or two that they come out the library than to dig for them later. I didn't mention last week the death of Paddy Chayefsky at age 58. He died from a cancer. I don't know whether it's a Jack Ruby cancer or Martha Mitchell cancer. There's a town in Pennsylvania that's doing research on cancer houses or areas where certain people die to see if it's a virus or what's causing the cancers in any particular section of this town. I think that the researchers should get together now. It's time to have a chart of people that, political activists, civil rights people, people from the arts and lawyers and so forth that die at very early ages of cancers or witnesses to trials that are wiped out at early ages of cancer. Paddy Chayefsky did many things for movies and TV, but I guess his finest was Network. I think that was the best thing that I remember him for. And he had that famous line where the people are looking out the window and yelling, "We're mad as hell, and we're not going to take this anymore." They didn't like what was going on, and they began yelling and screaming. There are a few lines of Network that are worth remembering, and to describe Paddy Chayefsky, I thought maybe I'd just read a couple of those with you from the movie Network, when the audience is yelling back, "We're mad as hell, and we're not going to take this anymore." He gets on television as a television newscaster, and he says, "You and 62 million other Americans are watching me right now, and less than 3% of you read books. Less than 15% of you read newspapers, because the only truth you know is what you get over the tube. There's an entire generation right now who never knew anything if it didn't come out of this tube. The tube is your gospel. It can make or break your presidents or your popes and your prime ministers. This tube is the most awesome damn farce, or force, in farce I add that one, in the whole godless world. And woe to us if it ever falls in the hands of the wrong people. This network," he said, "is in the control of CCA, Communications Corporation of America." He didn't say MCA or whatever letters you want. He said CCA, one of the largest companies in the world with their damn propaganda force. It's a whole godless world, this tube. Who knows what crap, I'll put that instead of the other word, will be peddled for truth on this tube. Television is not truth. Television is a damn amusement park, a circus, a carnival, a traveling troupe of acrobats, storytellers, singers, dancers, lion tamers, sideshow freaks, football players, baseball players. We're in the boredom-killing business. If you want the truth, go somewhere else, anywhere. You're never going to get truth from us. We'll tell you anything you want to hear. We lie like hell. We'll tell you Kojak gets the killer, that there's no cancer in Archie Bunker's family, no matter how much trouble the hero's in. Look at your clock, and at a moment when it's just about over, he'll win. You people sit there, he said. Paddy Chayefsky put this in the network. Day after day, night after night, all ages, colors, and creeds, all of you, you're beginning to believe the illusion we're spinning here. You're beginning to think the tube is reality, and your lives are unreal. You do whatever the tube tells you. You dress like the tube. You eat like the tube. You think like the tube. It's mass madness, and you maniacs, in God's name, you people are the real thing. This is Paddy Chayefsky's script. He said, turn it off now. And then as a result of what he says on there, he's taken into the offices of Valhalla, that's the TV executive, and he is given his instructions by Mr. Jensen. He says to him, you have meddled with the primal forces of nature, Mr. Beale, and I won't have it. You think that you have stopped businesses. That's not the case. The Arabs have billions of dollars from this country. They'll put it back. It's ebb and flow. You are an oil man who thinks in terms of nations, and you must think of people. There are no nations. There are no people. There are no Russians. There are no Arabs or no Third World or the West. There is only one system, multinational, interwoven, petrodollars, electrodollars, multidollars, Reichsmark, pounds and shekels. It's an international system of currency, and that's what runs the planets. There is no America. There's no democracy. It's ITT, IBM, ATT, DuPont, Dow, and Exxon. And that's what it is, he tells them. There are no nations. There are corporations. You don't live in a world of nations. That is Paddy Chayefsky. And those were his words. I was reading his words from Network. We'll take a 1-minute break and get back onto the radio, not the TV.
This concludes the first half of World Watchers International with Mae Brussell. We will return with the second half after a brief pause.
Okay, in the second half of this program, I want to go into a little bit of explanation of organization of the way I have to begin to think and handle the way the news is gushing out. There are so many names, there's so many pieces of this international puzzle. How did America become ITT or Exxon or Dow Chemical? What was it that turned what we thought was a nation into a corporation, what Padachevsky was talking about? The major event that I can see after World War II that really turned things around, and I want to talk about those events in this half hour, and then the subsequent items that are breaking now, was the first thing that I think was important was the killing of John Kennedy in 1963. And killing Kennedy was bad enough, but the first cover-up that I began to study, at least, I could go back to Alger Hiss or the Rosenbergs or the cause of World War II, but starting in September 64, the Warren Report was the first cover-up of the killing of the President of the United States. And the members of that Warren Commission covered up the involvement of our own agencies, the CIA, the use of organized crime, the use of the Pentagon and Defense Department, the international funding from Rome, Italy, that's linked now to Licio Gelli and the Italian scandal, the use of the church and the Antichrist and the fighting the Antichrist, the anti-communist group, the intent, the fanatical desire to put down anything that even touched of socialism or social reform became linked with communism or Antichrist. And there was also an anti-Catholic pitch to this that's going to come out more, you'll see it more as time goes on, and the use of Nazis in the CIA, in the Defense Department, with organized crime. You had a front of people working together, the Defense Department, the federal agencies, organized crime, and Nazis from Germany, that were protected by the Warren Report in 1964. Watergate came along in 1972. There was no big investigation of Robert Kennedy or Martin Luther King's death. And when they got caught at Watergate, the same team, the same gang, they were investigated by the Senate Select Committee and Leon Jaworski, and that was the second major cover-up of a lot of killings as they killed their major witnesses during the Watergate hearings, and witnesses the Kennedy assassination were also being murdered. Then the Rockefeller Report came out in 1975, and that was the third cover-up. Ronald Reagan was on that team, and when the Watergate story became unglued and started going back to Dallas, they quickly came out with the Rockefeller Report on domestic operations. That was followed by a fourth cover-up, Representative Pike's report, where he mentioned 400 agents of the news media who worked with the intelligence community, and they were never identified for us. And Daniel Shore was removed from his programs and on the air. And then the Korea Gate came along, the paying off of members of Congress, the Korean CIA, and the compromising of our Congress, and that was another cover-up. Then the Senator Church Committee began investigating the murder of political leaders by the CIA, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, Fidel Castro, the attempted murders, many of them, and they're still going on from 1961 up to the present date, the attempts to murder him, the murder of Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, and Rene Schneider down in Chile, and of course then followed the murder of Salvador Allende. Richard Nixon said in 1970, he told CIA Director Richard Helms that Allende regime would not be acceptable to the United States. Those were his words, and their hearing had that printed in there. It wasn't acceptable that they have this man elected president. So these cover-ups were going on continuously. The Senator Church Committee, then there was Sam Ervin's investigation of mind control programs and institutions of prisons and hospitals doing mind control programs. And that was another cover-up. That was a seventh cover-up because it went into the testing of the CIA, not the administration. Once you discover how to make aspirin, you don't test it every year. You have the formula. or penicillin, and you just start distributing. So the distribution's going on now, the medical and the physical mind control, the operations, the electrode implants, and the hypnosis, and whatever it takes to make assassins remember, forget, or to kill, or to lose their minds, or to commit suicide, all the things that they had in their hearings, the way to cause schizophrenia so a doctor won't recognize it, and so forth. They called those testing programs where they really were administered. So that all held from 1963 pretty firm up through 1975. The people that had been murdering their own witnesses, even during the hearings, the Senate hearings of Senator Church, primary witnesses were being killed right and left, like John Rosselli, Jimmy Hoffa, Sam Giancana, George de Mohrenschildt, William Sullivan of the CIA, Carlos Prios Siqueiros, the former president of Cuba. This isn't about those murders, but the line or the dike or the cover-ups of these illegal actions were holding until 1978. They did pretty good from 1963 until 1978. Then the House Select Committee on Assassinations issued their report, and the report came out with the conclusion that there was a conspiracy to kill the President of the United States and to kill Martin Luther King, the President, John Kennedy, and they went as far as saying organized crime, but they said there was a conspiracy. Now, there were a series of events, important articles and important events that I'm going to run down in chronological order that they include all the names I've been throwing out on the air for the last few months. I've given you many, many names, but I'm charting these events, and then I have large graph paper, and I'm putting cities and states and countries and banks and the modus operandi where they all overlap and interconnect, because what I'm listing for you is interrelated. It's not isolated. While the House Select Committee was doing their investigation of Martin Luther King, and before they got the John Kennedy investigation, or at the same time, Jonestown happened. That was November 19th, 1978. And that involved weapon caches, mind control, criminal experiments against people, Nazis, drugs, and so forth. 1978 to 1979 was when Michael Sindona was locked up. The Franklin National Bank crashed in 74. But his links to the CIA, the Vatican, the organized crime, to John Connolly, the Gambino family, and so forth, the Sindona story got full-blown 1978 and 79. January 28, 1980, a few months later, Frank Nugent was found murdered with William Colby, the CIA director's name and information about him. That bank was blown up, exposed. The $500 million to $1 billion was missing in Australia. It involved people like John Paisley, going back to Kennedy assassination, George Bush, our vice president right now, Mr. Pipes, one of the big officials under Alexander Haig, the National Security Council. The Nugent Bank collapsed, and Frank Nugent was murdered. 12 people directly linked to that have been murdered, and many more since. January 28, 1980. 2 months later, March the 10th, 1980, Gene Harris shot Dr. Tarnow up in Westchester. Now, that story involves organized crime, mystery trips, the CIA, trips to China, Russia, Africa, Gulf of Western. That has not even been scratched. The story of why Dr. Tarnow had to be murdered, and Gene Harris, the instrument and the co-partner of him in these various operations. But 2 months after the Nugent Bank collapsed, and shortly after the Michael Sindona conviction, the Tarnow murder took place in Westchester, New York. And by March the 10th, 1980, the exposures began to come out about the Wells Fargo Bank in California, with the $200 to $300 million missing. That was this year. The Wells Fargo interlocking links became more evident in 1981, but that was just at the beginning of this year. The Wells Fargo story, connections to Guyana, Australia, Nigeria, and so forth. That was a very important event. December the 8th, 1980, John Lennon was murdered. And this Mark David Chapman had been from DeKalb, Georgia, Beirut, Lebanon, Fort Chaffee, Tennessee, with the CIA, Laotians, and Vietnamese, Hawaii, Zurich, Switzerland, and London. He had important connections and was not separate from these events. The newspaper stories were breaking right and left, and every one of these has a relationship over and over again to each other. But in March 1981, this is March 30th, Ronald Reagan was shot by John Hinckley, and the connections of John Hinckley Sr. have yet to be revealed. The Christian Front organizations, the CIA, his AID links through World Vision to Cambodia, Nigeria, El Salvador, the attorney they use, Edward Bennett Williams, John Connolly's buddy, and their links to George Bush and so forth. I'm taking these names and events and putting them in a long list of pages going down and then cross-filing and charting the interconnecting links. May the 13th, Pope John Paul II, the attempted murder of the Pope. The Reagan murder didn't happen, but we don't know the consequences of the shooting. We don't know how the Pope will survive or the consequences of that shooting. They got the message, and they're very quiet, and so far, I don't doubt if they'll ever say a word about that. And then May 30th, 7 days or so, or 23rd, after the Pope was shot in Rome, the Masonic scandal that had been going on since World War II broke open. The head of the organization, the fascist head that wants world Nazism, fled to Argentina, and he's hiding down there, and his daughter was arrested with documents about the CIA in her pocket. Also, there was that covert operation shortly before Ronald Reagan was shot down at Crystal River that was described in a new article, Counter-Spy, or Covert Action rather, the Caribbean coup attempt. This was an important event. This was March the 20th at Crystal River in Florida, where these men were picked up near an atomic plant, and we didn't see their names. And then later they were involved in the Dominican invasion try down in Central America here, and this also, again, involved the name Connolly, the world Nazi organizations from Canada, the United States, the head of the Klan. It involves Houston, Texas. It involves using Dominica. They want to use it as a narcotics operation, gun running to South Africa, using swastikas, and sending out Nazi literature all over the world. Now, the important articles that came out recently, and I've had them individually on other programs, that are throwing these names, interweaving them in and out that I've been using. The first one was that June 14th New York Times article by Seymour Hersh called The Gaddafi Connection. The next one was the following week in the New York Times, June 21st, exposing the Libyan link. It has more to do with the United States and our CIA and our Defense Department and our modus operandi than it ever has to do with Libya, and I think I've mentioned that to you before. And then a week later, July the 1st, the Village Voice, Alexander Cockburn and Ridgway had an article, or have, called The CIA Australia and the Nugan Hand Bank in Australia. Now, I'm making note on a chart of the source of the information, how it's coming out at this time, like a New York Times article, and the date of the information, and then, as I say, making a link of the names that are involved, the cities and the countries, the organizations, and charting this out. I did this when the Watergate story first broke. I would take each day, every article, and put the new names, the new cities, the places, and began to assemble these people into some kind of a chronological and alphabetical order. But the way the system is getting unglued now, and I use the word unglued, is that many important articles, full-page newspaper articles, not little tiny articles, are coming out, and if you know how to look, you'll get these names and pieces of information and be able to start to put some of this together. Well, we had the New York Times articles by Seymour Hersh, and he's now writing a book about Henry Kissinger. I hope it's a Lulu and a good one about Kissinger and his Nazi friend Fritz Kramer and Alexander Haig. But getting back to the Village Voice, July the 1st, excellent article on the CIA and the Nugan Hand Bank, which goes into the very people that are mentioned by Seymour Hersh in the New York Times articles just preceding these. Then the covert action, I call it counter-spy, it's the covert action newspaper that's put out. If you don't have it, P.O. Box 50272, Washington, D.C., 20004. Now, they have a list of the characters of the Crystal River plan that got off because I want to have time at length to go into this operation and what it really means. And they were planning to assassinate somebody in the United States. They had assassination plans, and the Dominican invasion can't be put off from just the standpoint of a bunch of kooks. The Caribbean coup attempt in covert action and the description of these people in that issue is very, very important. Then the Washington Post, July the 12th, had the article that I've mentioned on the air, The Mystery Angel of the New Right, Richard Mellon Scaife. Now, the Mellon family are not new money. They're the richest family in America, probably, the Gulf Oil family. And Miss Richard Mellon Scaife, his sister, one of the Mellons, was married to Senator John Warner, who lives next door to Edwin Wilson. And I don't know what the Mellon money or influence had, but I'm sure that there's an intertwining group between this Senator John Warner, who is very, very conservative, and Mellon, who was up the money for the far right. That involves Young Americans for Freedom, Richard Vagary, and again, going back to the John Kennedy assassination, the group that was brought to Dallas from Germany by Nazis in Germany and neo-Nazis in the United States government. I don't like to use the word neo, but these were Americans that brought in people and Nazis and people who were wearing swastikas and armbands into the Dallas-Fort Worth area for the purposes of being used at the time of the Kennedy assassination. The Washington Post ran their story, full, large thing, on Richard Mellon Scaife. And then the Los Angeles Times ran, this is June 24th, a story, Moneymaker turning to role of Kingmaker. And this is David Murdoch. And this is a very excellent story. And there's one in November 1979 of Fortune magazine that I just got on David Murdoch, and I'm outlining that too. And the reason I decided to run down these names for you and the sources of information for future programs is because in outlining the Fortune article about David Murdoch, I realized how many bases he's hitting here with the Watergate team, the Kennedy assassins, the countries, the interests, the preponderance of interest in Australia, New Zealand, and insurance firms, and where he gets his funding, and the secrecy of David Murdoch. There are men like Howard Hughes and Daniel Ludwig and David Murdoch, the self-educated, didn't get through high school, became multi-billionaires, set up fronts in their name, privately owned corporations that nobody can go to, taxpayers don't know what goes on, and they can fund unlimited espionage operations because they're totally owned by these people. So they go from Howard Hughes didn't start from scratch. He had an education, but Murdoch and some of these other new giants didn't have that kind of an education. They started with nothing and become these multimillionaires with mysterious secret backgrounds. Then the Los Angeles Times, August the 2nd, had a two-part article. One article was in one section, not the business section, saying From Oil to Films, a Giant Step. And that's about Marvin Davis, who I mentioned briefly last week. He bought 20th Century Fox, the Pebble Beach Corporation, and this is a very important article for you to get August the 2nd, 1981 from the Los Angeles Times. Then in the business section of the Los Angeles Times, their same issue, August the 2nd, 1981, is a large picture, a full page, The Takeover of Fox, a drama of wealth, intrigue, and passion. Now, when I wrote my articles on the SLA or Watergate or the Senate Select Committee, those are my first published articles that I did in The Realist for Paul Krasner. And I thought that the ground rules were to put a cast of characters to put their personalities and what the people involved did and where they worked and where they came from. Then have a chronological succession of how the events preceded or took place that led up to finding themselves, say, at the Watergate Hotel or the Patty Hearst kidnapped by the SLA, and how the Watergate was covered up by Sam Ervin and the Senate and Howard Baker and that gang. But I put my article in chronological order, and I had a cast of characters, my articles. Well, Los Angeles Times does that for the first time, maybe this will be a journalistic style. This is the way these things should be if they're to inform you. You don't need flowery introductions and all kinds of words to flow that melt things together. They have the cast of characters, they have the pictures of them, they have events in chronological order, because this, what they call this drama of wealth, intrigue, and passion involves removing and having fired a man who was president of the 20th century for 10 years, Mr. Stanfield, graduated from Annapolis also with Mr. Turner and Jimmy Carter, and to take over a man close to Frank Sinatra, to Gerald Ford, who was on the Warren Commission and covered up the killing of John Kennedy for the Nazis and for Navy intelligence, a man who immediately put on his board of directors Henry Kissinger, and Gerald Ford, and Madame Chenolda's on that board, and Princess Grace of Monaco. You have a very international group of people, and they've been involved in espionage and intrigue for a long, long time, and going back certainly, say, to the era of the Kennedy assassination, Sinatra and Kissinger and the Gerald Ford and the whole gang. So that these news articles are very important. There's some good stories about Mr. Casey and Mr. Max Ugel and Thurl Wheeler murder in Oklahoma that's linked to Illinois, and to Boston, the Telex president who was murdered recently. There are a lot of people, a lot of witnesses to what I'm talking about being killed. I don't even have time to run down in the program. The news story that is breaking, and alongside about the name of the person who was murdered just prior to it breaking, such as the arrest of the big drug kings down in Florida, and then right at simultaneously the airplane crash of Torrijos, or the McNeil brother, June 1st, and these other stories falling right on top of that, new exposés coming up. There's an exposure, there's a death, there's death of primary witnesses, and in order to hold the line, and I call it holding the line, because these people are really have to be running scared, they have to kill each other off. They have various ways to do it. They have car crashes, they have their cancers, they have putting them in car compressors, the back trunk, like Jimmy Hoffa. They gun them down like Sam Giancana, cut them up and put them in a drum like John Rosselli. They can shoot them in hunting accidents like William Sullivan. But there are a tremendous amount of obituaries that are simultaneously taking place. And what I think is happening is that the interlocking links of these pieces are coming apart. Now, some of these writers that are doing these things don't even see all the connecting links, but they know something is happening. I don't know the reason why so many pieces of information are flowing together at this time. I think some people are genuinely afraid of Ronald Reagan and Alexander Haig and fear that we're on the brink of World War III. Some people felt that Haig attempted a coup and was very overt in his so-called takeover as soon as Reagan was shot. A lot of people know for a long time that these conspiracies went on. I'm not the only person. I didn't pull them out of my hat. These names are interlocking names that good authors and good documents and Senate hearings and investigations and congressional hearings and court cases have put together. And a lot of journalists, in writing their particular article, whether it's about the killings in Santa Barbara or the Nugan Bank, may not be making the connections, but by throwing out the names, the organizations, the institutions, they're providing pieces that are interlocking and fitting together. And there's too much money floating around missing. Hundreds of millions of dollars that has been involved in gun running, illegal shipping of weapons to South Africa, training assassination teams. It's used for espionage. It's linked to organized crime, narcotics, and there's no way to solve the bank mysteries and the narcotic traffic without tapping into those main stories that I've mentioned to you before. In closing, I just want to give you again another quotation. This isn't from Patty Chayefsky, but this is Kenneth Lamott. I picked up a copy of his book. I have one at a book sale yesterday. He wrote a book called Anti-California Report from Our First Parafascist State. Lamont died an early death. He died last year. He wrote this in 1963. This was 18 years ago. And he warned us about what was going to take place, what's happening today. What we see in our headlines today and the insanity we see didn't just happen this way. You don't just wake up and find all these crazy things that are going on. They've been going on for a long time. If you wanted to see them, it's like the lines and network. It's there if you want to see it. If you don't watch the tube, if you turn it off, if you read the papers, if you have conversations, you'll know that these things are going on, and the tube is there to entertain you. And if you want entertainment, turn the tube on. And if you want to know the future, maybe read Kenneth Lamont's book, Anti-California Report from Our First Parafascist State. He has a picture of Ronald Reagan, our great governor of California, and he said 18 years ago, here in California, we are to begin with governed by a charismatic buffoon. Men so clownish it's hard to take them seriously as politicians. Men who are not reluctant to use their tremendous powers. See, it isn't California's problem anymore. It's yours back there in New York or London or wherever you go. This is your problem now. It's not just California. He said they use their power. We are the garrison state preeminent, with 1/3 of the people here depending for daily bread on bombs, missiles, napalm, and other obscene items found in the catalog of death. We are engaged in open warfare against an internal enemy who's described in terms that would have instructed Goebbels. Goebbels was Hitler's great chief, in case you young people don't know who Goebbels is, because you probably don't see his name on television. And then he says that enemy, of course, is our own young people. And he goes into the problems in the Golden Gate Park, at Isla Vista, the riots up at the University of California, and he refers to S.I. Hayakawa and Ronald Reagan. He says there's a frightening report. This is an account of corruption in California, problems with San Quentin inmates and so forth. Kenneth Lamont was in the Navy. He had a good education. He graduated from Yale. But he understood California perfectly 18 years ago. He wrote that a long time ago. And now the man that he wrote that about is the President of the United States, and he's out there chopping wood, ha-ha, and he's riding his horse, ha-ha, and he has plenty of problems because he put in as his CIA director Mr. Casey, who was a close associate of Robert Vesco. And if Bobby Hall wasn't murdered, we'd have a different story about Ronald Reagan and Paul Laxalt, who put him into office, and the California mob, and Frank Sinatra, and Ed Davis, the Los Angeles police chief, who got the tapes of Bobby Hall. And we'd learn about Howard Hughes and Robert Mayhew and the assassination teams. But Bobby Hall was shot. He was shot through a window eating some cherries. I think it was a July evening a few years ago. And the tape recordings that tell about these shenanigans are on those tapes. But many people know what's going on. Edwin Wilson knows. Frank Terpil knows. Michael Sindona knows. Michael Hand knows. I could go on, and I do say that there's too many people that know. Every time Wilson makes a bargain to bring in a few dead people for his immunity, then it backfires and another thing happens, that it will expose the intrigues that are going on. This is a complicated series of events that have taken place for the past 18 years. I'm going to try sometimes to update you on a list of them, and other times just talk about one particular event and set that straight. But I want you to know that there are many good pieces of information there now if you want to read them. And if you want to write to me, I'll send you the printed sources so you can look them up. In the meanwhile, turn off your TV, do what Patty Chayefsky told you to do. Start reading and figuring things out and studying it more, because it's only your life, and why give it to them so easily? In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. You take care, and I'll be back with you next week.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.
This is Timothy Leary, broadcasting from KLRB Carmel, your high orbital station on planet Earth.
The Taj Express, a series of contemporary Indian stories.
Time now for the Taj Express on KLRB FM 102. Brought to you by the Pilgrim's Way Metaphysical Bookstore, located near the post office in Carmel on Dolores near 6th. At the Pilgrim's Way, you'll find a unique selection of natural crystals, New Age music tapes, meditation and healing tapes, as well as books on the occult, alchemy, tarot, Oriental philosophy, astrology, and other interesting subjects. Many of the secrets of the universe were discovered by the ancients, and their findings live on today in books and accessories from Carmel's most unique bookstore, The Pilgrim's Way, just a few doors down from the post office on Dolores near 6th, Carmel by the Sea. Open 7 days a week. And now, tonight's Taj Express, brought to you by the Pilgrim's Way Bookstore in Carmel.
The Pilgrim's Way also wants you to know that they can now duplicate your cassette tapes while you wait.